Night had settled quietly over Harlem. The streets were still alive with distant music. Somewhere a trumpet cried through the smoky air of a jazz club. Laughter spilled from crowded doorways. Taxi headlights slid across wet pavement like silent ghosts. But a few blocks away from the noise and the lights, another kind of meeting was taking place. A small wooden building stood alone at the end of a dim street. No music, no neon, no crowds. Inside, 15 men sat around a long table. The room smelled of tobacco and cheap whiskey. Smoke drifted slowly under a single hanging lamp, turning the air gray and heavy. Wooden walls absorbed the low hum of conversation. These men were members of the Ku Klux Klan. They were not here for celebration, they were here to make a point. White robes rested over their shoulders. Some had removed their hoods, letting them lie folded on the table like strange pale cloths. Others kept them close by, a reminder of the organization they represented. Their mood was relaxed, almost amused, because tonight they were expecting someone, not a group, not a delegation, not an army. Just one man. One of them leaned back in his chair and took a slow drink from a glass of whiskey. "So this is the man they're all afraid of?" he said. Another man chuckled. "That's what they say." A third tapped ash from his cigarette into a tray. "Harlem's little king." The laughter spread around the room. Outside the window, the street remained quiet. The kind of quiet that comes just before midnight settles over the city. Inside, the men continued talking. They spoke about Harlem with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. A neighborhood growing louder every year. Jazz clubs, gambling rooms, crowded streets full of energy and ambition. To them, Harlem looked like something that needed to be reminded of its place. Tonight's meeting was meant to deliver that reminder. One man glanced at the clock on the wall. "He's late." Another shrugged. Maybe he changed his mind. More laughter. Because, in their minds, there was only one logical outcome to this situation. 15 against 1. The door at the far end of the room remained closed. Then footsteps appeared. Outside. Slow, even, deliberate. Laughter softened slightly as someone turned his head toward the sound. The steps stopped at the door. For a moment, the entire building seemed to pause. Then the door opened. A man stepped inside. He was not large, not physically intimidating. His suit was simple but carefully pressed. His posture was straight, controlled. His face was calm. It was Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, and he was alone. No bodyguards followed behind him. No weapons were visible. Just the quiet sound of the door closing as he stepped into the room. For half a second, silence hung in the air. Then the laughter exploded. One man slapped the table with both hands. "You've got to be kidding me." Another leaned forward, studying Bumpy as if examining something unusual. "He really came alone?" Someone else shook his head in disbelief. "I thought Harlem gangsters traveled with an army." The laughter grew louder. It bounced off the wooden walls, filling the room with mocking amusement. But Bumpy Johnson did not react. He didn't argue. He didn't glare. He didn't speak. Instead, he simply looked around the room. His eyes moved slowly from one man to another, observing faces, posture, attitude. Some men were leaning back confidently. Others watched him more carefully, because something about the way he carried himself did not match the situation. This was a man surrounded by enemies, 15 of them. And yet there was no tension in his shoulders, no hesitation in his steps, just calm. Bumpy walked toward the table. Each step echoed softly against the wooden floor. The laughter continued, though slightly less confidently now. One of the men gestured toward an empty chair with a sarcastic smile. "Well, don't just stand there. Sit down." Bumpy reached the chair. He pulled it back slowly. The legs scraped gently against the floor. Then he sat. The room fell slightly. Quieter, not silent, but quieter. The men exchanged looks with one another. Perhaps they had expected anger. Perhaps they had expected fear. Instead, they were facing something far more confusing. At man, he looked completely comfortable. One of them leaned forward, elbows on the table. "So you're the man running Harlem now?" Bumpy did not answer immediately. He simply folded his hands on the table and looked at the man speaking. The moment stretched. A few of the others chuckled again, though the laughter was no longer as loud, because slowly, something in the room was beginning to shift. Confidence can be contagious, but so can calm, and the calm sitting across the table from them felt unusual. The man who had spoken earlier tried again. "You must be a brave man," he said, "walking in here like that." Bumpy finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled. "You asked for a meeting." The sentence was simple, nothing dramatic, but the way he said it made the room feel smaller. Another man scoffed. "Yeah, we asked, and you actually came." More laughter, but again, not as strong as before, because the men in the room were starting to notice details. Bumpy Johnson wasn't sweating, he wasn't fidgeting, he wasn't scanning the room nervously. He was simply sitting there like a man attending an ordinary business conversation, and that realization created a strange kind of tension, because confidence in the face of overwhelming odds usually means one of two things. Either a man is foolish, or he knows something everyone else does not. One of the Klan members leaned back slowly in his chair. "Well," he said, "since you're here." The room waited. Somewhere outside, a car drove past, its tires whispering across the pavement. Inside, the hanging lamp flickered slightly. 15 men, one man sitting across from them. The meeting had finally begun, but no one in that room could have guessed that the next 8 minutes would become one of the most whispered stories in Harlem's history. 8 minutes that would travel through barbershops, jazz clubs, and crowded sidewalks. 8 minutes that would turn a quiet gangster into something closer to legend, because when Bumpy Johnson eventually stood up from that chair, the laughter would be gone, and the men who once mocked him would watch silently as he walked out of the room. No shouting, no violence, just silence. And sometimes, silence can be the loudest victory of all. Long before the whispers in Harlem. Long before men in smoke-filled rooms spoke his name with caution. Before the stories, the rumors, and the legends. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was simply a boy trying to understand the world around him. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in the early years of the 20th century. It was a time when America was changing, but not for everyone at the same pace. Charleston was a beautiful city from a distance. Old buildings, warm air drifting in from the harbor, narrow streets filled with the sound of carriage wheels and early automobiles. But for many people, life there was defined by rules that were never written down, yet everyone understood them. Power belonged to certain people, respect was rarely given freely, and justice could be uneven. Young Ellsworth Johnson grew up watching this world closely. According to people who later knew him, he was not the loudest boy in the neighborhood. He observed, he listened, he paid attention to the way adults spoke when they believed children were not listening. Stories from those years describe a boy who seemed unusually thoughtful, while others ran through the streets, chasing trouble. Ellsworth sometimes sat quietly, watching the rhythm of the neighborhood unfold around him. He noticed how arguments started. More importantly, he noticed how they ended. Because in every community, power reveals itself in small moments. Who speaks first, who speaks last, and who never needs to raise their voice at all. At some point during his childhood, Ellsworth developed a small bump on the back of his head. It was nothing serious, but children notice everything. Soon the nickname appeared, Bumpy. It stuck. Names have a strange power in the streets. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes they grow larger than the person who carries them. For Ellsworth Johnson, the nickname would eventually become known far beyond Charleston. But at the time, he was still just a teenager trying to find his place. Life in the South during those years could be harsh, especially for young black men looking for opportunity. Many families believed that the future might exist somewhere else, somewhere north, somewhere like Harlem. By the time Ellsworth was still very young, his family made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of his life. He would leave Charleston. He would go to Harlem. At first glance, Harlem in the 1920s looked like a place bursting with possibility. Music drifted from every corner. Writers, musicians, and artists were creating something extraordinary that would later be called the Harlem Renaissance. Nightclubs were full. Poetry was alive. Energy filled the streets. But Harlem also had another side, behind the bright lights. And the music existed a complicated underground economy. Gambling operations ran quietly in back rooms. Money changed hands in ways the law rarely saw. Protection deals were arranged over quiet conversations. And the people who controlled this world did not wear uniforms or badges. They were businessmen of a different kind. Young Bumpy Johnson stepped into this environment with curiosity rather than fear. The streets of Harlem had their own language, their own rules. Some people tried to dominate those streets through violence. Others tried to survive through silence. But Bumpy Johnson seemed to be studying something deeper. He watched how deals were made. He noticed which men were respected, and which were merely feared. Fear, he realized, could fade quickly. Respect lasted longer, and the most powerful men often used very few words. Stories from Harlem during that time often describe Bumpy Johnson walking through neighborhoods with quiet focus. He was not yet a famous figure, not yet a leader, but he was learning when to speak, learning when to wait, learning that patience could be a weapon just as powerful as strength. Another detail about Bumpy Johnson surprised many people who later encountered him. He read not occasionally constantly books filled with philosophy, poetry, history, literature. People who met him years later would sometimes recall something strange. A gangster who could quote poetry in the middle of a conversation. Some found it fascinating, others found it unsettling, and because intelligence in the underworld could be more dangerous than aggression, a man who understood people, understood strategy. And strategy wins battles long before anyone realizes a battle has begun. Over time, Bumpy Johnson began meeting the people who quietly shaped Harlem's underground world. Numbers runners, street operators, club owners, small businessmen who depended on stability to keep their doors open. He listened more than he talked, and that created something unusual. Trust is not easily earned in environments where betrayal can happen overnight. But Bumpy Johnson developed a reputation for something rare. Consistency. If he made an agreement, he kept it. If he gave his word, people believed him. Slowly, very slowly, the streets of Harlem began to recognize him, not as the loudest man, not as the most violent, but as a man who understood how power actually worked. And power, when understood correctly, could shape entire neighborhoods. Years later, people would try to explain the rise of Bumpy Johnson in many different ways. Some would say he was simply in the right place at the right time. Others believed he possessed something far more unusual. A mind built for strategy, a personality built for patience, and a reputation that grew quietly, long before the rest of New York realized what Harlem was beginning to understand. Because legends rarely appear suddenly. They are built slowly, one decision at a time, one quiet observation at a time. And somewhere in those early Harlem streets, the foundation of the Bumpy Johnson legend was already being laid. By the middle of the 1930s, the streets of Harlem had developed their own rhythm. During the day, the neighborhood looked like any other part of New York City. Shop owners swept the sidewalks. Children ran through the streets. Music drifted from open apartment windows. But when evening arrived, Harlem transformed. Jazz clubs filled with smoke and trumpet melodies. Card games began quietly in the back rooms of small bars. Men in tailored suits moved through the night, with purpose, conducting business that never appeared in newspapers. Money moved through Harlem in ways the outside world rarely noticed. And where money flows, power follows. In this complicated environment, reputation mattered more than anything else. A man's reputation determined who trusted him, who feared him, and who refused to cross his path. During these years, Bumpy Johnson was slowly building a reputation that stood apart from the rest. Unlike many figures in the underworld, Bumpy did not try to dominate through loud displays of strength. He rarely shouted, he rarely rushed. Instead, he moved through Harlem with patience and observation. People began noticing something unusual about him. He listened carefully when others spoke. He remembered details, and when he finally gave an answer, it was usually the right one. In places like Harlem, those qualities could be more powerful than intimidation, because every street operator understood the same truth. A reckless leader might win a fight, but a thoughtful one could win an entire neighborhood. Bumpy Johnson started forming connections with the people who quietly kept Harlem functioning. Bar owners who needed stability to keep their doors open, neighborhood runners who managed gambling operations across the streets, musicians who depended on safe venues to perform every night. These relationships were not always formal. Often they were built through simple conversations. A man might approach Bumpy with a problem, a dispute over territory, a misunderstanding between operators. Sometimes the situation might be solved with nothing more than a calm discussion. Other times, the mere presence of Bumpy Johnson in the room was enough to settle the matter. People began to realize that Bumpy carried something unusual for a man involved in criminal operations. Discipline. He dressed neatly, often in well-pressed suits. He spoke calmly. He maintained an air of composure that rarely cracked. One Harlem bartender later described the effect When Bumpy walked in, nobody panicked, he said, but everybody paid attention. That kind of attention was not based on fear alone. It was built on respect, and respect travels quickly through neighborhoods where reputation is everything. At the same time, Harlem itself was changing. The neighborhood had become a cultural center, attracting musicians, artists, and writers from across the country. That culture also attracts business. And business attracts powerful interests. Crime syndicates from downtown Manhattan were watching Harlem carefully. Italian organized crime groups were expanding their operations across the city. They controlled gambling, liquor distribution, and many other profitable enterprises. From their perspective, Harlem represented opportunity, but Harlem was not an easy place for outsiders to control. The community had its own leaders, its own networks, its own loyalty. And standing in the middle of that structure was Bumpy Johnson. He understood something that many outsiders did. Harlem was not just territory, it was a community, a living system of businesses, clubs, families, and relationships that could not simply be taken by force. Some gangsters saw territory as something to conquer. Bumpy Johnson saw it as something to manage. This difference made him valuable, not just to Harlem, but eventually to people far beyond the neighborhood. But before those larger alliances appeared, Bumpy had to establish something first. Authority, and authority in Harlem did not come from violence alone. It came from stability. People began to notice that when Bumpy Johnson was involved in a situation, things tended to settle down rather than spiral out of control. Disputes were resolved. Agreements were honored. Businesses kept operating. That kind of consistency created trust, and trust created influence. Another unusual detail about Bumpy Johnson continued to surprise people who encountered him. He read constantly. Books filled his apartment shelves, philosophy, literature, and poetry. Some nights he could be seen sitting quietly in a club corner, reading while music played around him. At first, people found this strange, a gangster who read poetry. But over time, that detail became part of his reputation, because intelligence added another layer to the image he was creating. Many men in the criminal world relied on aggression. Bumpy Johnson relied on strategy, and strategy requires knowledge. People who dealt with him soon realized something important. He thought several moves ahead, like a chess player studying the board. If someone attempted to deceive him, he usually recognized it quickly. If someone attempted to manipulate a situation, he often predicted the outcome before it unfolded. This ability made him both respected and dangerous, because a man who understands the game is difficult to defeat. By the mid-1930s, stories about Bumpy Johnson were spreading beyond Harlem. Operators in other parts of the city had heard about him. Some described him as a quiet leader, others described him as a man who could maintain order where chaos once existed. But perhaps the most interesting description came from those who had watched him work closely. They said Bumpy Johnson rarely needed to threaten anyone. His reputation spoke before he did, and reputation, once it reaches a certain level, becomes a powerful form of protection. When people believe a man cannot be easily challenged, they rarely attempt to challenge him. That belief was growing stronger every year, but with growing influence came a new reality. Attention, more powerful figures in the underworld were beginning to notice Harlem's quiet strategists. Men who controlled vast criminal networks were looking north toward the neighborhood that Bumpy Johnson had helped stabilize. Some of them wondered whether Harlem could be controlled from outside. Others believed cooperation would be more profitable than conflict. Soon, those questions would lead to one of the most unusual alliances in organized crime history, an alliance that would connect Bumpy Johnson with one of the most powerful figures in the American underworld. But that meeting had not happened yet. Now, Harlem simply knew one thing. When Bumpy Johnson walked into a room, the atmosphere changed. Conversations slowed. Decisions became more careful. And even the toughest men in the neighborhood understood a quiet truth. Respect was no longer optional. It was automatic, because by the mid-1930s, Bumpy Johnson had become something more than just another operator in Harlem's underground economy. He had become a leader. Not through loud declarations, not through public displays of power, but through patience, discipline, strategy, and the rare ability to make people believe that when Bumpy Johnson spoke, the conversation was already over. By the mid-1930s, Powell, in New York City, was quietly being reorganized. The city looked chaotic on the surface. Newspapers reported gang wars, arrests, and shootings. Rival groups fought over alcohol shipments, gambling territories, and control of neighborhoods. But behind that chaos, a few powerful figures were beginning to think differently. Instead of endless wars, they wanted structure. Instead of chaos, they wanted order. And the man leading that transformation was Charles Lucky. Luciano had a vision for organized crime that was far more strategic than anything that had existed before. Rather than allowing gangs to constantly destroy each other through violence, he began building something resembling a corporate system. Territories would be respected, agreements would be honored, conflicts would be negotiated before they became wars. This new structure would later become known as the Commission, a council of powerful crime families that quietly influenced much of the underworld across America. But for Luciano's vision to work, he needed stability in every major part of the city, and one neighborhood stood out: Harlem. Harlem was not just culturally important, it was economically powerful. Gambling operations, nightlife, entertainment venues, and informal businesses created a steady flow of money. Yet, Harlem was different from other parts of New York. It could not simply be taken. The community had its own leaders, its own systems, its own loyalties, and at the center of that network was Bumpy Johnson. Luciano understood something many others ignored. Trying to conquer Harlem by force would create endless conflict. Working with Harlem would create stability. According to various accounts from the era, the first contact between the two men was quiet. No dramatic confrontation, no threats, just a meeting arranged through intermediaries who understood that both men valued efficiency. Some say the meeting happened in a private office. Others claim it took place in a restaurant after midnight, long after most customers had gone home. Whatever the location, the atmosphere was likely calm. Two men studying each other carefully. On one side of the table sat Lucky Luciano, the architect of a new criminal order. On the other side sat Bumpy Johnson, the quiet strategist who understood Harlem better than anyone else. Neither man needed to prove his reputation. Both already knew who they were dealing with. Luciano's interest in Harlem was practical. The neighborhood generated enormous revenue through gambling and nightlife. But maintaining control there required more than muscle, it required trust. And trust could not be forced. Bumpy Johnson already had that trust. For years he had maintained stability among Harlem's operators. Businesses respected him. Street organizations listened when he spoke. Luciano recognized that fighting Bumpy Johnson would not only be difficult, it would also be unnecessary. Cooperation would be far more profitable. According to some versions of the story, Luciano made a simple proposal: Harlem could continue operating under Bumpy Johnson's leadership. In return, certain business arrangements would benefit both sides. The details of these arrangements were never officially recorded. Organized crime rarely leaves written contracts, but historians believe the agreement likely involved gambling operations and protection networks that connected Harlem to broader systems across New York. The partnership worked because both men understood boundaries. Luciano controlled vast operations across the city. Bumpy controlled Harlem. Neither attempted to interfere unnecessarily in the other's domain. This kind of balance created something rare in the criminal world: stability. Soon, Harlem began experiencing a period of unusual order within its underground economy. Disputes were resolved quickly. Outside gangs thought twice before attempting to disrupt operations, and businesses operating quietly behind the scenes were able to function with fewer interruptions. People in Harlem began noticing the difference. Problems seemed to disappear faster. Conflicts that once dragged on for weeks were settled in hours. Some believed Bumpy Johnson had simply become more powerful. Others suspected something larger was happening behind the scenes. Whispers about his connection with Luciano began spreading through the streets. For many people, the idea seemed almost unbelievable. A Harlem strategist working alongside one of the most powerful Italian crime bosses in America. But the partnership made sense. Luciano valued intelligence and discipline in the people he worked with. Bumpy Johnson possessed both. More importantly, Bumpy understood something Luciano respected deeply: control, not loud control, not theatrical displays of power, but quiet authority that people naturally followed. Some stories claim that Luciano once described Bumpy Johnson as one of the few men he trusted completely in Harlem. Others believed the relationship was purely business, mutual respect without friendship in the world they operated in. That was often enough, but alliances like this always attract attention. Other figures in the underworld noticed the stability Harlem was experiencing. Some admired it, others resented it, because whenever one man becomes powerful enough to stabilize an entire neighborhood, someone eventually begins asking a dangerous question. What happens if that power disappears? Enemies began appearing quietly. Some were rival operators who disliked Bumpy Johnson's influence. Others came from outside the criminal world entirely. Political groups, organizations driven by ideology rather than profit. One of those organizations had been active in many parts of America for decades, an organization built on intimidation, secrecy, and fear, the Ku Klux Klan. For years, the Klan had attempted to assert influence in various communities by spreading threats and demonstrations of power, but Harlem was not an ordinary community. It was proud, it was organized, and it had leaders who did not respond well to intimidation. Still, rumors began circulating. Certain groups believed Harlem needed to be reminded of who truly controlled America. Businesses were quietly pressured. Messages were delivered in ways designed to provoke fear. Eventually, word of these activities reached Bumpy Johnson. People expected an aggressive response. After all, the criminal world often solved problems through retaliation. But Bumpy Johnson approached the situation differently. Instead of sending men into the streets, instead of organizing a violent response, he chose something far more unusual. He agreed to a meeting some of his associates were reportedly shocked. Meeting with the Klan directly was risky, potentially dangerous, but Bumpy Johnson had spent years studying people and power structures. He understood something important. Sometimes, the fastest way to end a problem is to confront it calmly, and so the meeting was arranged. 15 men from the Klan would attend. They believed they were about to intimidate a neighborhood representative. What they did not realize was that the man they were meeting had already negotiated with some of the most powerful figures in organized crime. Compared to those conversations, this one would be simple. The night of that meeting would later become one of the most mysterious stories connected to Bumpy Johnson, a moment where reputation, intelligence, and strategy replaced violence. And it all began with one quiet decision: to walk into a room alone.